Hello again, Steve here. A few thoughts this evening on a book that I'm reading. Now, I don't read very many books. I may have mentioned it before. I graduated from high school functionally illiterate. Had never read a book. My first book that I actually read was when I was backpacking around Europe a few years after I graduated from high school. And I think the book, it was a James Herriot book, All Things Bright and Beautiful, or something to do with sheepdogs. I forget what it was. It was the first book I read. I read several books after that. Quite enjoy reading now, though I still am hampered by the lack of exercise, shall we say, in the exercise. But I do read books once in a while, and I try to get into the habitual practice of doing a little bit of reading before I go to bed and when I get up in the morning. Try to keep up with that. The latest book that I'm reading is a book that I just happened across because I was at an event that my friend was putting on, and he had a little raffle, a door prize, and he was giving away a book, and I happened to win the door prize. It's called Loving What Is by Byron Katie. 4 questions that can change your life. Now, I'm sort of, I guess, recovering New Ager in a way. I mean, I grew up in a very religious family, uber religious family. In fact, I was chuckling with somebody the other night who I knew was a Mennonite. And Mennonites, sometimes they like to tell me how hard they had it. You know, they couldn't watch TV and they couldn't listen to radio, and they had big families and they had no extra soup at them at the bottom of the pot at the end of the night. And I like to say, well, I must have been a Mennonite then, because I mean, I didn't grow up as a Mennonite. Catholic, similar enough, I guess. But I mean, we were a big family even new immigrants will tell me sometimes, if they come from very poor countries, how bad they had it. You know, they only had one pair of shoes and so on, and I had the same pair of shitty boots to go to school as shovel the shit out of the barn. So I can relate, I think. And we weren't allowed to have TV. We weren't allowed to listen to the radio. We had to sneak over to the neighbors to watch, the Dukes of Hazzard. I remember the first time I saw Daisy Duke's shorts, it was like, wow, Anyway, that was my little bit of my tale. But anyway, so I grew up in a very religious environment, and I would say that I left that. And very often I find that noticing people who come from a religious background, they will, once they decide that it was bogus enough for them, they'll leave it. But there's like a void, so they'll join something else, right? And I sort of became a hippie for a while, and I consequently sort of became I would call it New Agey in a way, I would say. And then had a little bit of rebound back into the old tradition, hybrid of this and that. So I get it. I get, the path people are on. I would say this, I haven't read much of it, but it seems a little bit New Age. I could be wrong when I get into it more. Nevertheless, there's some good value in there. I think the basic value that I'm taking from this so far is this lady, Byron Katie. Her name was originally Byron Kathleen. Well, her name is Mitchell now. That might be her married name, but Stephen Mitchell, I think that's her husband. Anyway, she has an interesting story from what I gather so far. I mean, she had a very wretched lifestyle for a while. She was extremely upset. She was abusive to her children, all that sort of thing. And she had a turnaround, and she was able to get a hold of herself, and now she teaches people on how to do something along the lines of what she did. And she has these 4 questions, which I think are great. Not necessarily, I don't know if they're the greatest questions, but when we're trying to dig ourselves out of something, it's sometimes to asking ourselves questions, or if we have somebody else to ask us these questions, or some kind of questions, rather than dictating to ourselves or being dictated to, allowing us to discover through the questioning process. And I'll put these out. So what she does in this one scenario there, where she's sitting across from somebody, and somebody is going on how her life is the shits, telling this to Byron, how her life is the shits. She hates her husband. She hates having sex with him. He's a big stinky fart, a sack of farts. And Nothing about him does she like, and it's all his problem that her life is the shits, right? So she goes through this process of asking these questions and continues to ask them, and lets the other lady who's bitching to unload and so on. And eventually she comes around to realizing that, yeah, actually it's all hers, right? She looks in the mirror, proverbially, eventually, right? So the question she asks, and here's just some food for thought: is it true? So a lot of times when we say this is the problem, I mean, the question is that true? Is it really true that that's the problem? And the next question is, when we double down, when we say, well, yeah, it must be still, are we absolutely sure that it's true? Are we absolutely certain that it's true? And, because as she talks about in here, a lot of times, she's talking mostly about what goes on in her mind, right? That she talks about pain as most of the pain that we suffer in things like relationships and what have you have to do with our perception of what is rather than what is. I mean, I don't agree with that all the time. I mean, if somebody, if an elephant steps on our toes, I don't know how we can perceive it to be any other thing than extremely painful, right? I mean, this is a physical reaction which is there for a reason, to try to get us to pull that foot out of there. But what she's mostly talking about is things that we build up in our minds, which is by far the most of our troubles. And, are these things really true? I mean, we just conjure all kinds of stuff, and we have the ability to dream all kinds of fanciful stuff up, sleep or awake. So is that true? And I think that's a really good question to ask. Now, the next question she asks is, how do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? So that's an exercise in observation, really. Okay, so I say this to myself, in this lady's case, I hate my husband. Well, how do you act? How do you notice yourself acting when you play that out over and over again? It's dismissive, it's ignorance, it's rudeness, it's not helping out with supper or, anything to do with his interests. All these sorts of things would be answers for that, right? And this helps with the visioning process, I think. This last one that she asks. Who would you be without those thoughts? Those debilitating thoughts, those thoughts that are taking you in a direction that are making you feel miserable. Who would you be without those thoughts? Imagine that for a moment and start to think. So I think there's some real value in there. I mean, she's had quite a following, and it must be working for somebody. Like I say, I haven't read through much of the book, but I just wanted to put it out there that I was reading it, and not so much as an advertisement for it, but just as an example of how we can find value in a lot of things. It's not to take it literally. It's to understand where people are coming from. In her example is where she came from and what she was able to create from that very debilitated situation, as I could see it, of feeling extremely miserable herself. And, her thoughts leading to actions which were destructive to herself and to her family. And the treatment of her kids was appalling. It seemed to be, in terms of her just lack of being a good parent. And apparently she was able to turn that around, so that's an inspiring story, if nothing else. That's what I wanted to share this evening. It's great talking again. Like I always say, I'll have to do this again soon. Steve here again. Sign off for now. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye for now.